Clay McKinney, Developer On-Ramp. This is the section about forms. And what I've done here is I've cheated. I pasted this list of information that we've already talked about rather than making you watch me type it. But I want you to type it. So I've made sure that all of it's on the screen and you can pause it and you can type it in. Typing it in will help you remember it, and you'll save the file and you'll have it locally and you'll have a record of it so you can look things up. And it's got some important links. And I want to review by going over what it says here. Okay, so the first thing I did, notice this is a bulleted list and with list items. The first thing I did is I linked to the forms documentation on the Mozilla Developer Network, right? So let's see, I've already saved this. Let me go refresh this in my browser. Okay, and I'll follow this link so you can see where it's going. Okay, so right, Mozilla Developer website about HTML stuff. And when you get to developer.mozilla.org, there's a link to forms at the top. And then you can just kind of copy and paste that URL. This section on forms has all sorts of form elements that you can use. And it's very in-depth. And each one of them, you can click in it and it tells you about the attributes and all of that stuff. Very, very useful. All right, so that's the first thing I did, was I linked to the documentation. The rest of this we talked about. Forms start with a form tag. Oh, I need to go back further, don't I? Yeah. So we've been using that form tag. The action attribute identifies the URL of the target of the form, where to send the data. Now remember, we did that a couple lessons ago. I said action equals google.com or something like that. And when we submitted the form, it went over to Google. And I took it out because it made it, kind of hard to work. That's important. Also, a lot of times you will see forms without an action attribute. And I want to make a note here. Often replaced using JavaScript. When we get to our JavaScript course, you will see that a lot of times when you submit a form, there's JavaScript code that handles it and decides where to send it. The input tag, so we've got our input tag here. Type, well, that's our submit button. We also have one here, that's our text box. The input tag creates form elements. Form elements are sometimes called controls. That's a holdover from other programming languages. Mostly, you would have like a Battleship Gray form and you would drop controls on it. But form elements in particular are often called controls. Other HTML elements could be called that, and I suppose sometimes are, but it's a lot more common for form elements. Okay, so in a input element, the type attribute controls which kind of input you get. And we talked about how type equals text is the default. So our first name input tag doesn't have a type attribute. Our submit does, type equals submit. And I wrote that down here too. The text value of the type attribute makes a text box. And I want to make a note that that's the default. The submit value of the type attribute submits the form. It turns your text, it turns your input element into a submit button. And then I put this in here because there's a lot more type attributes, and they added a lot a few years ago, and so there's still some browsers out there that don't support some of them, and there's some that have been standard for 20 years that we just haven't talked about yet. So I wanted to have this placeholder here so we could talk about them. The okay, so that's it about the input tag. And here's our next item. The label element associates human readable name with an input. And that is all we've talked about as far as the tags go, the form tag, the input tag, and the label tag. We also talked a little bit about HTTP verbs, and you'll remember that when we were talking about our form tag, we could say method equals get or method equals post, and method equals get is the default. I need to make a note of that. Method equals get is the default, so right now we're doing a get because we're not saying, right? And we played with this in a previous lesson. Remember that get writes it to the query string, page URL after the question mark, query string, and so yeah, and a get is supposed to be used to just retrieve something, get it, right? Retrieve it so you can read it. It's not supposed to really change anything, but you know, people use it sometimes. But a post is what you're supposed to use to if you're adding new information or creating new information. The post, instead of putting the information in the URL, it puts it in the header of the HTTP request, so that if your HTTP request is encoded, then it can't be read, right? So you can't. Well, I mean, you can encrypt something and put it on a query string, but it's kind of weird, you know. I mean, normally you would just post it and off it would go. So post is related to creating and adding, and we did that in a previous lesson. All right, so this is what we've done. Also, I want to show you that I linked separately to the documentation on HTTP verbs, and that there's a lot of other verbs here besides get and post. There's patch and put, delete. Those are, it's possible to use those with an HTML form, but it's almost never done. Usually when you get into other verbs besides get and post, you've also gotten into JavaScript, and you are wrapping all of this information that people are putting into the form, you're wrapping it up into a JSON object and sending it, and doing JavaScript stuff with it and sending it to a backend and backend servering it. Right, so most methods you don't need right now, but you do need to know get and post right now, and that's what I talked about here. But there's your documentation. You got your documentation. Okay, so this was a bit of a midway review, but mostly I wanted to just get caught up so that we could add to this as we go along. Okay, I'm going to save it because I changed it a little bit. Go back in here and refresh it. I added a whole lot of text, so I feel like we need to validate it. Validator w3.org. It's easiest right now to validate by direct input. Control A, Control C, Control V, check. Okay, no errors or warnings. It's green. Everybody's happy. Thank you.